Good afternoon, and thanks for being here. My name is Robert Gudmestad, and I am the author of The Devil's Own Purgatory, the United States Mississippi Squadron in the Civil War. And I'm a professor of history at Colorado State University. And I just appreciate you taking some time out of your day to hear a little bit about some Civil War history. I began working on this book when my daughter entered kindergarten, and she's now a freshman in college. So this has taken a long time, and I'm just excited about the content of the book and excited how it came out. It's been 12 years of research, and people who have looked at the Civil War, some of them are not familiar with the Mississippi Squadron. So I'll tell you what the squadron was, and then why it was important, and then I'll speak to the sailors in the squadron as well, and sort of what sets this book apart from maybe some other works on the Civil War navies. The Mississippi Squadron did not exist in 1860 when South Carolina seceded. By 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered, it was the Union's second largest navy when measured by number of boats. It had about 120 boats, and it was one of 5 squadrons. And so it was big. And this is the first time that the US government built an inland navy since the War of 1812. And this particular squadron was necessary because both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, recognized that the rivers were going to be crucial. So we're going to be talking today about the Western Theater, what historians call the Western Theater. There were 3 theaters in the Civil War. The Eastern Theater was primarily Virginia. There was the Trans-Mississippi Theater, which was the far west. A couple battles took place, Civil War battles took place in New Mexico. But the Western Theater was this big area in the Mississippi River Valley. Sorry, that's my cat. Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, recognized that they needed to control the rivers in order to win the war. But they went about it differently. For the Confederacy, it was primarily a defensive strategy. They built forts, and they built forts along the major rivers like the Cumberland, the Tennessee, and the Mississippi to try to prevent boats from accessing Confederate territory. The Union, by contrast, built boats, and they were going to use these boats to penetrate Confederate territory. And the Mississippi Squadron operated in close association with Union armies. And the Union recognized early, the military leadership in the Western Theater recognized that the Army couldn't win alone, the Navy couldn't win alone, but the two of them had to work together. And that's one of the secrets for the Union winning the war in the West, is it figured this out. The Confederacy didn't figure this out very well. And the Confederacy was also hampered because it just couldn't build as many boats as the Union could. And I'll get to that in a little bit. The first boats of the Mississippi Squadron, what became the Mississippi Squadron, were called timberclads. And they were existing steamboats that the Union purchased and then converted to military vessels. And the Union wrapped different. They used oak on these boats as armor, essentially. And after that, then the Union built what were called ironclads. And these ironclads were huge metal monsters. And the biggest ones, probably the best ones, were known as the 7 City class ironclads. And the Union built them from the keel up. And they were about 60 yards long. They had metal plating on them that was 1.5 inches or 2 inches thick and could stop musket balls. And they had 13 cannons. And these cannons were big Navy cannons. So the the artillery for the infantry had relatively small cannons. The Navy had these large cannons. They were known as 68 pounders, which meant that they could shoot a cannonball weighing 68 pounds about 2 miles. They had 13 of these cannons on the ironclads, and they had a crew of anywhere from 150 to 200 men. These were big, big boats. And the Union also had boats to support this fleet. They had the Navy's first hospital boat. It was called the Red Rover. It had rooms for patients to recover. It had rooms for surgery. It was, for its day, it was really advanced. This fleet had an ammunition boat. It had a repair boat, and then also had a bunch of smaller boats known as tinclads that are going to be in some ways, the most important boats for the fleet in the second half of the war. So it was truly a fleet in that it had a bunch of different boats, and they were meant to do different things. Well, the primary thing that these early boats were meant to do was to batter these Confederate forts. And the Union got good at destroying these Confederate forts, at least forcing the surrender of these Confederate forts. And so there are some famous battles like Fort Henry and Fort Tennessee and Island Number 10, where the Union infantry and the Union Navy, the Mississippi Squadron, worked in conjunction with one another, where the Army would surround the fort on the land side, and then the Navy would be on the water side, and the Navy would bombard the fort and try to soften it up, and then the Army would attack. And in every case, the Union was able to force a surrender. Now, sometimes the Navy did really well. Sometimes the Navy did very poorly in these battles, but working with the Army, they could force a surrender. So over time, the Union began to penetrate into Confederate territory, especially into Tennessee. The big prize, however, was Vicksburg, Mississippi. Abraham Lincoln said that Vicksburg is the key, and unless we have that key in our pocket, we can't win the war. Now, Ulysses S. Grant was the most successful general in the Western theater, and in 1862, he wanted to take Vicksburg, but he was going to take it with a land campaign. So he started marching his army into northern Mississippi, following the railroad. And as he got further and further, his supply line was more and more tenuous. A Confederate general then attacked the supply line and cut it off, and Grant had to retreat. And he tried a couple other ways to take Vicksburg, but he realized that he had to rely on the Navy to take Vicksburg. So Grant moved his army from the eastern side of the Mississippi to the western side. So they crossed up sort of near Memphis. The Union controlled that territory at the time. Then he began marching down the western side of the river, marching on the levee, essentially into Louisiana. Now he had to ask the commander of the Mississippi Squadron to do something that this commander, his name was David Porter, didn't want to do. Grant asked Porter to take some of his boats and risk them and run past the guns of Vicksburg. Now, Vicksburg was very heavily defended, and it had cannons not just facing outward for Union armies, but also facing the river to attack any navy that might go after the city. Porter reluctantly agreed. In April of 1863, he took about 7 of his boats and some transport vessels, and around midnight, they set off. And originally they were just floating down the river because they wanted to be as quiet as possible. Gunboats and steamboats generally were very noisy. You could hear them coming before you could see them, but they were floating down the river. But eventually the Confederates noticed their presence and set up some flares and illuminated the scene. And so now the engines kicked in, and these boats then ran past Vicksburg. And this is crucial because now Grant has some boats from the Mississippi Squadron south of Vicksburg. And then he uses those boats to take his troops from the western side of the river to the eastern side of the river into Mississippi. If you want to call this an amphibious landing into hostile territory, which I think you can, this is America's largest amphibious landing until June 6th, 1944, also known as D-Day. Grant now has his army in Mississippi, and then eventually he's able to take Vicksburg. But again, he has more help from the Navy because the Navy essentially seals off Vicksburg from the riverside and prevents supplies from getting to the town. So the point I'm making is that the Mississippi Squadron was crucial for winning the war in the Western Theater. And some historians argue that the Western Theater was the more important theater, more important than the Eastern Theater. That's a debate for a different day. But Grant can't win the war, and he can't take Vicksburg in 1863 without the help of the Navy. And that's what I argue in this book, is that the Mississippi Squadron was an essential partner in winning the war, almost an equal partner to the Army. And that kind of gets lost, I think, in a lot of histories of the Civil War. But this wasn't the only thing that the fleet did during the war. The fleet also destroyed a really small Confederate Navy that was on the Western rivers. The Confederate Navy had one large vessel, the CSS Arkansas, and it had a bunch of smaller vessels. They were known as cottonclads. They weren't very powerful boats. They were small, and they took cotton and they pressed it in between wood, and they were hoping that this would kind of serve as an armor. It didn't work very well, and the Confederate fleet gets obliterated at the Battle of Memphis, Tennessee, that took place on June 6th, 1862. So the Union fleet helps defeat Confederate armies and take territories. The Union fleet also defeats the Confederate fleet. It fights a third kind of war where it's working in conjunction with some Union armies in the Western Theater on what were called joint operations. These went badly every time because they exposed the weaknesses of the fleet. The fleet would be caught in these smaller rivers like the White River in Arkansas or the Red River in Louisiana, the infamous Red River expedition of 1864. And the low water meant that the boats couldn't maneuver very well, and they were very close to the banks. And if they're close to the banks, they could be attacked very easily. And in every case, these joint expeditions with the Army turned out badly. The fleet also had another battle to fight. And I argue in the book that in some ways, this was the most important battle, or the most important thing that the fleet did during its 4 years of existence during the Civil War. But let me explain the context a little bit. As the Union Army got further into Confederate territory, it had to supply its armies, and that supply line was longer and longer, and it was a little bit more difficult to protect that supply line. And we saw that with Grant in 62 when his supply line got cut. That's this landborne supply line. But the Union actually probably shipped more of its supplies via the water than it did by railroad, at least in the first 2 years of the war. Well, they were shipping these supplies on steamboats, commercial steamboats that the Union either rented or commandeered, and they were staffed by civilians. Confederates realized in early 1862 that if they could cut off this supply line, this waterborne supply line, they could stop or slow down the Union armies. Napoleon famously said an army marches on its stomach, and armies need a lot of supplies, they need a lot of food. So the Confederacy had a deliberate strategy, what I call the ambush strategy, of attacking this Union supply line. And it's effective. It's effective enough where the Mississippi Squadron has to change the way it operates. So the first thing that it does is it begins to devote boats to guarding, to going after these Confederate ambush squads. These ambush squads were collections of Confederate cavalry and Confederate artillery, and they would have anywhere from 15 to 200 men, and they would have these camps along the river, and they would spring ambushes in vulnerable places where Union boats had to slow down or maybe go around a big bend of the river or where it was difficult to navigate. And they would hit these Union steamers and either capture them or sometimes destroy them. And if they captured them, then they could, of course, take the supplies from them. It was a real problem. So the Union then begins to try to find these Confederate guerrilla bands, and they're basically playing whack-a-mole because Confederates will pop up somewhere and the boats will go and they'll attack, and then the Confederates pop up somewhere else. And that strategy just wasn't working. So the Union built a different kind of boat, and it was called a tin-clad. And the tin-clad was a commercial steamer that had boilerplate on it, a very thin plate of iron that could stop a musket ball but couldn't stop a cannonball. And it built about 70-ish of these boats and then spread them along the river. And it put them in a patrol system. Now you had a boat that was patrolling about 10 to 15 miles of river. It was going back and forth. And literally all along the Mississippi, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, parts of the Ohio, and even into the White River, you had these boats that are just patrolling back and forth. And when you had a Union supply boat that's coming along, this boat would escort it during what it was called a beat, or its little patrol area, and then it would pass it off to the next boat, and then that boat would escort it along a beat. Well, Confederates didn't stop their attacks, and in fact, the attacks grow more serious in 1862, 63, and into 1864. Like the middle, about 2.5 years of the war, you have this really nasty guerrilla war that's happening along the Mississippi River and the Cumberland and the Tennessee River. It's an insurgency. And this is, again, until the Vietnam War, this is really the first time that the federal government, the United States Navy is fighting this counterinsurgency along a river. And now the sailors in the Mississippi Squadron are having to do things that they didn't sign up to do. They are stopping at farms and plantations. They're getting off the boat and they're raiding and attacking sometimes Confederate ambush squads, sometimes Confederate civilian property. These guys had no idea when they signed up that they were going to be doing this, and actually nobody did in this Union Navy. So the whole purpose and tactics shift in the middle of the war for the Mississippi Squadron. And I think that's one of the great reasons why this squadron was effective, is that it was adaptable. So these sailors now realize that white Southern civilians are assisting this insurgency by sheltering Confederate soldiers, by giving them food, by giving them information. So now the fleet, the sailors are going after Confederate civilian property. So if you are a Confederate living along the Mississippi River and guerrillas use one of your barns to shoot at the Union fleet's going to come by and burn down the barn and burn down your house. Now they're going to allow you to escape, but so they're not attacking and killing civilians, they're attacking civilian property in the hopes of tamping down this rebellion. And the sailors, like, they're frustrated. They don't want to fight this war. And so they take some of their aggression out on these civilians. And they were especially fond, the sailors were, of shooting cannons at pianos and seeing what kind of destruction a cannonball can do to a piano, because a piano was a symbol of wealth and gentility, and they wanted to go after these slaveholders. The Union Navy is effective in guarding its supply lines during the middle of the war, and argue that without the fleet doing this, the Army would not have been able to get as far into Confederate territory as it could. So those are basically like the four wars, if you will, that the Mississippi Squadron fought. But I want to shift now and talk about the sailors in the Mississippi Squadron and the research that I did on the sailors, because this is something that's different than a lot of historians have done in the past. So Corey, if you could show the one slide that we're going to show this afternoon, and it looks like it started. I learned about halfway through this research that there was something called, well, I learned early in the research that there's something called muster rolls, and that screenshot in the center of the slide is a muster roll from the USS Carondelet. And a paymaster had to fill out a muster roll every 3 months so that the sailors could get paid. But these muster rolls have a tremendous amount of demographic data on them. And you probably can't read it, but it has a sailor's name, his rating or his rank, when he enlisted, where he enlisted, his previous vessel, where he was born, the previous state of which he was a current state of citizen, like if did he come from Ohio, his age, his occupation, his eye color, hair color, skin color, and his height, and comments. A lot of demographic information. So I decided about halfway, 2/3 away into the research, that I wanted to build a data set of these sailors. And as you can see from the slide, I collected demographic information on over 14,000 sailors in the squadron. No one has done this amount of demographic work on Civil War soldiers or sailors ever. So I used a team of students from Colorado State University where I teach. Some are grad students, some are advanced undergraduate students. And we read these muster rolls. And then if you look on the bottom part of the screen, we put the information into a spreadsheet. So that's like the corresponding spreadsheet from the Carondelet. And then we translated that into data and into charts and into graphs and into statistics. And I benefited from this because of the students working with me accelerated the process, but they also benefited because they learned research tips and tools and techniques. And we would meet and we'd talk about the data. Several of them have gone on to grad school. I co-wrote an article with one of them, Evan Kokenauer. I'm co-writing another article with another student, Sean Nelson, on the team. So it was really valuable for all of us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data. Corey, you can stop sharing the slide. So I can confidently say that in this fleet, 48% of the men, and they're almost all men, were born in the United States. They're white men born in the United States. Now, this is substantially lower than the Union Army. 32% of the Mississippi Squadron were immigrants. That's substantially higher than the Union Army. Union Army had probably, let me get my statistics here, probably about 18% immigrant. 3% of the Mississippi Squadron were free Black men. And 17% of the Mississippi Squadron were formerly enslaved men. So 20% of this fleet were Black men. In the Army, that's about 10%. So the rate is double for the fleet for a variety of reasons. Now, when we're looking at men who were native-born white men, the state that contributed the most men to this fleet was Ohio. 25% of all native-born white men were from Ohio, a really high statistic. When we look at immigrants, they're born all across the globe, from the Azores to Zanzibar. There's even one sailor who was born, as he put it in the muster roll, at sea under the English flag. Not surprisingly, though, most of the immigrants were from Ireland. 39% of all immigrants were Irish. In fact, in the entire fleet, 13% of the men were Irish. That's a large number. Then after that is the rest of the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, and counting Canada as well as part of the United Kingdom back then. That's about 20%. And then after that were the German states. Germany wasn't unified yet, but there was Bavaria and other states. And if you put them together, it was about 16%. Now, when we look at immigrants versus native-born whites, immigrants were much more likely to have some kind of maritime background than native-born whites were. About 25% or 1/4 of native-born whites had some kind of agricultural background. Basically, they were farmers. For immigrants, it was 8%. But when we look at a maritime background, native born whites were 19%, immigrants 34%. So a lot of these men, I believe, saw this as an opportunity. A lot of the immigrants saw this as an opportunity. And in looking at formerly enslaved men, a lot of them were from Virginia and Maryland, and they'd been bound up in the slave trade and transferred into the Deep South. And a few other things that I could do with the statistics was to think about a turnover rate. And what I argue in the book is that this fleet had a really high turnover. In 1864, the fleet basically almost turned over completely and had to get new recruits. But I did a study of 9 boats, and I thank Austin McGurr for helping to collect the data on them. But those 9 boats had a 3-month turnover rate of 24%. So in other words, every 3 months, they had almost 1/4 of the fleet was new, which is a shockingly high number, especially compared to the Blue Water Navy, where the turnover rate was very low. And part of this was desertion, and part of this was disease. And these sailors just suffered immensely from malaria, especially in spring and summer of every year. And because of, especially in 1862, so many sailors were suffering from malaria. This was a time when the fleet was almost, 95% white. The fleet is forced to allow the enlistment of enslaved men. So at the very time when the fleet is expanding the size of the fleet in 1862 and 63, its enlistments are dropping, at least among native-born whites and immigrants. So the fleet is then bringing formerly enslaved men into the fleet. And so in the middle of the war, like a third of all new sailors are formerly enslaved. And I believe that this fleet doesn't do what it can do or what it did during the war without these enslaved men. And the fleet helps bring down slavery in the American South, because not only does it bring men onto these boats as sailors, but it assists in slaves from plantations to run away and to get to what were called contraband camps in the North. So the fleet, fights this regular war, it fights this irregular war, and then it kind of fights this war against slavery in what historians call military emancipation. One last thing, sailors, for the most part, hated being part of the Mississippi Squadron. They didn't reenlist for the most part. Their reenlistment rate was really low. And the quote from the book, The Devil's Own Purgatory, comes from a surgeon on a boat. And he was talking to an Irishman. And so he tries to write with an Irish accent. And he quotes this Irish petty officer saying that with the mosquitoes on one side and the damned rebels on the other, it's like the devil's own purgatory. And conditions were terrible for these men. These boats were hot, especially in the summertime, because, on a metal boat that's absorbing the sun's rays for the majority of the days, they got extraordinarily hot. They're heated by steam power. The cruel irony is that these sailors never sailed. These boats had no sails. They were all steam boats. And whereas the Blue Water Navy, they had boats that were both steam and sail. And so these guys were just frustrated, and they drank a lot. They got into a lot of fights. Discipline was low. I write in the book about one captain who tried to sell his boat to the Confederates for gold and for cotton. There's another one who got captured. It's the only time that most of a boat's crew got captured on land. They went to a church service in Rodney, Mississippi. So it's kind of this weird but important and I think fascinating tale of Civil War history. So with that, I will pause, and I think we're going to do a question and answer for a little while.
Thank you so much for that, Robert. That was a wonderful presentation, and I especially love that data set. It's really cool to kind of like see how history is made. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in the chat. Thank you, Rashid Chowdhury and Bill Gorski, both for saying hello. Um, Rashad is tuning in from Toronto and Bill from Arlington Heights, Illinois. So thank you
Nice.
both for tuning in. I wanted to start. Well, if you tuned in the beginning, we saw a little visitation from Robert's cat. So I wanted to ask you what your cat's name was.
Um, my cat's name is Pedro.
Nice. All right. That was great. Um, do you have the book on you? It's a really beautiful cover, and I was
I
wondering
do, yeah. Yeah, the
if you
L2
could.
Press did, I think, a fabulous job. Uh,
It's
it's,
yeah. It's kind of like for some reason it wants to not
yeah, I
show it,
know.
but
Well, there, it's
yeah,
got a
there
little
we
bit
are.
more.
Yeah.
I originally had a different idea for the cover because this book, in a lot of ways, is a social history of the sailors.
Hmm.
There are a couple of photographs of sailors, like crew on these boats. It's rare to have a picture of the crew on these boats, but there are a couple of them. And so I suggested a picture or a photograph of the crew, and it's in black and white. And the editor at LSU Press says, "Yeah, that sounds good." Then he writes an email the next day, and he said, by the way, let's not use that as the cover of the book." And he explained his reasoning and said, "The cover is the only place where we can use color because the illustrations inside are in black and white." And he said, "What about these illustrations?" And he had done some research, and this was one of the suggestions that he had. And I said, "Yeah, okay, that sounds like a good idea." And then so I didn't really give it a second thought. And then a few months later, I get an email saying, "Here's our proposal for the cover." And it was, I think the word was, "We're very proud of it. We think it's really striking." And I looked at it and I said, "Yeah, that's perfect." Because it looks a little apocalyptic, which I love.
I We have a comment from the chat that I wanted to share from Joseph Creighton, who says, "Let Dr. G know that Pedro is not as cool as Stonewall." So I thought I would
Yeah,
share that
yeah.
with you.
Joe is a friend of mine. Yeah, we had a former cat named Stonewall. So for a while, I got to name all of our pets, and they're all named for Civil War figures. So we had Stonewall, we had Abe, and we had some other um, pets named after Civil War people.
I have a question for you, and I do want to thank Rand Dotson, who kind of like helped me think about this book and put these together. But I wanted to know why has the U.S. Navy's efforts on rivers during the Civil War been so overlooked or forgotten?
That's a good question. I think first of all, more people are familiar with and have studied the Eastern Theater. So especially the fighting in Virginia and then Gettysburg. Gettysburg was it's the biggest land battle in North America. It's the biggest battle of the Civil War in terms of number of men involved and casualties involved. The focus of the capitals, Richmond and Washington, the mystique of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson on the Confederate side. So automatically there's more attention paid to the Eastern Theater. And then now we're in the Western Theater. And again, I think there you've got Ulysses S. Grant. And he rises through the ranks, especially has adversity. And so Grant is this compelling figure for the Union in the West. William Tecumseh Sherman begins in the West. So you have these compelling individuals for the Union, especially. And I think people are just more familiar with soldiers than they are with the Navy. And the Navy's records aren't as good as the records of the Army. That's why I had to basically assemble this data set from scratch, more or less. You don't necessarily have to go quite to that length to do it for armies. And so I think historians just haven't studied the Navy as much either. It's harder to study.
That answer actually links me to one of the questions that I'd like to ask from the chat. This is from Rashed, and he wants to know, apart from the muster rolls you highlighted, what sorts of primary sources did you use in your research? Was it diaries, private letters, reports sent up the levels of the naval hierarchy? Anything else?
Yeah, definitely diaries and private letters. There were, when you look at it on a per capita basis in terms of numbers, it's a lot less for the Navy than it is for the Army. Soldiers just wrote a lot more than the sailors did, either at the time, either writing letters or diaries or reminiscences after the war. But I read every one that I could find. Then I read what historians call the OR, the official records of the War of the Rebellion, naval. There are about 5 volumes for the Western theater. I read through those. Then I went to the National Archives multiple times and I read boat logs. Now, sounds pretty boring, but every boat, now these are boats. Boats are on rivers, ships are on oceans. So they're called ship's logs in the National Archives, but they're really boat logs. So I read through the boat logs, and that's where I found a lot about the discipline of the sailors and descriptions of attacks on forts and a lot of other things, and sick lists and that kind of things. I found an amazing record of 2 boats freeing about 1,000 enslaved people from plantations in Louisiana. And no one's really used these boat logs to any extent. So I read a lot of them. And then another primary source were pension records. And for the Navy, a lot of the pension records are scanned. And if you have a subscription to Fold 3, you can view those scans. And so you can search for those pension records. And those gave some information about what life was like on these boats and what life was like for sailors after the war. Now it's a select sample because not everybody got a pension and not everyone applied for a pension. But this is one of the few ways that I could actually see the experiences of Black men on these boats, because they would dictate their stories and their words were recorded in these pensions.
Yeah, that's great. And really reminds me of a question that I'd like to ask you. So Bill, we're going to get to your question in a second, but I wanted to know, you mentioned in your data set that we have like 32% immigrants on the Mississippi Squadron, 3% free Black men, and 17% formerly enslaved men. What role did formerly enslaved men and free Black men who joined the U.S. Navy play in the river campaigns?
Unlike the Army, the Navy allowed Black men to be sailors prior to the Civil War. So prior to the Civil War, you did not have Black men in the Union Army or in the Federal Army. So the war with Mexico, all the men are white. But the Navy capped the enlistment at about 5% for Black men. And it was kind of an opportunity for Black men to get away from some of the restrictions of society. But as I said, necessity forces the enlistment of Black men in the Mississippi Squadron, also in the Blue Water Navy, and to a certain extent in the Army as well. But these men were forced into the worst ratings and jobs on boats. They were coal heavers. These boats are powered by coal, and they're doing exactly what you might think. They're shoveling coal from barges, bringing them onto the boats, and then they're bringing the coal and they're getting the coal under the boilers. So they're also firemen. So firemen weren't putting out fires, they were tending fires. So you're trapped inside of a metal box in front of a fire that's going all the time. Temperatures were 120, 130 degrees. And you had men who had heat exhaustion from being firemen. They're dragged out and they die. Nobody wanted to be a fireman or a coal heaver. So at the beginning of the war, immigrants were put into these positions, but then Black men are primarily in these positions. And so statistically, I can look in the data set and see that there's a much, much higher percentage of Black men who are in these roles. But also, these men were classified, now this is a rating or a rank, as a boy. Now in the pre-war Navy, a boy was an apprentice. And literally, he was a boy, he was a teenager, and he would enlist, and a boy would do a lot of errands and tasks. And he's learning the ropes. If you've heard that phrase, that comes from the Navy. You're learning how to tie ropes. So he's learning what life is like on board a ship, and he's learning to become a sailor. Well, in the Mississippi Squadron, you could have a boy. I found one who was 55 years old. So he's rated as a first class boy, but he's a man. And most of these boys were servants of the Union officers. So they are cooking for these men, they are cleaning their rooms, which is also emptying their chamber pots. They are sewing clothes, like fixing their clothes, mending their clothes. They're shining their shoes. They're doing menial tasks. And they're 30 years old. They're 40 years old, or they might be teenagers too. It's not that far removed from slavery, being in this servant position. They're getting paid for it, but they're not really sailors. They're not treated equally. And on boats, black men were in segregated messes. A mess was like a cooking and eating unit together. Black men were not supposed to man the great guns or the cannons. So there's rampant discrimination in the Navy. Now, if you look in the book, there's one photo that I'm very proud of finding. It's of a black boy. That was his rating. He was 11 years old when he left his plantation in Louisiana and joined the Mississippi Squadron.
Thank you for that. And actually, I do want to talk more about conditions, but I'm going to put a pin on it for right now because
Yeah,
I want to get to Bill's question in the chat. And Bill asks, what led you to this topic?
it was sort of a continuation of my second book. So this is my third book. My second book was it's entitled Steamboats and the Rise of the Cotton Kingdom. And so it's about the importance of steamboats and especially the Cotton South along the Mississippi River. So it's really a social history of steamboats on the Mississippi River. So it deals with, gamblers and racing, actually Indian removal, kind of surprisingly, and also the commerce along the rivers. But it stopped in 1860 with the war, and steamboats were never as important after the war as before. And I kind of cast around for some different topics, and I always kept coming back to the Mississippi Squadron because I know a lot about steamboats, and the works that I read, I just thought they didn't satisfy me enough. I thought that somebody could do more, and it took me a long time to do more, but it just the topic itself just kind of drew me to it.
Back to conditions, the kind of picture that I'm getting for the Mississippi Squadron in general, it's kind of a dismal picture, kind of for everyone, right?
Yeah,
And this is a little indulgent, but I am reading this book right now called The Great River by Boyce Uphold. Have you heard of that?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read
Okay.
it.
It's sort of a natural history of the Mississippi River. So this question is inspired by that. And something I've learned while I've been reading is that the Mississippi River is it's unpredictable, it's prone to flooding, it's confusing, there's endless paths, it's circuitous ways to get here and there, and it's always changing. Did you do any research at all on sort of the conditions? Because the sailing the Mississippi River seems kind of dismal as well in some ways,
Yeah.
and I'm just curious if the conditions affected the U.S. Navy in some ways that you saw, or if there were any kind of strategies that you saw that the Navy sort of conquered the river.
Yeah, it did. So the Mississippi River, especially, it curves back and forth a lot. And in some cases, then you get an oxbow lake, that's separated and the Mississippi goes, straight beyond it.
Right.
But the Confederates, so I don't know if people can see this, but where the river like did a big loop like this and kind of made a C, those were great ambush points because when you went around one of these turns, you had to slow down. And oftentimes you had to steer close to one bank or the other. And the Confederates knew that. And the closer you were to a bank, the more vulnerable you were to being attacked. So these were great ambush spots for the Confederacy. So especially at one turn, the Confederates could ambush, and then the boat would continue, and it's going to take it a while to loop around, but the Confederates can go directly across on that little peninsula part, and then they can spring another ambush because again, it's another favorable spot. So this happened all the time. Yeah. And so there's this amazing map in the official records where one um, captain, he he did what was called a cutoff. So these were common prior to the Civil War. So there's this loop, and in the map, like that circular part of land, he writes it's very bad guerrilla station. So what he did was to cut off the river. So he straightened the river and really made this Oxbow Lake and destroyed this town of Napoleon, Arkansas in the process. And what he's trying to do is to straighten the river and get rid of this ambush point. Now there are other places where the Confederates they would cut a hole in the levee, and they would have so they could go through the levee, and then they would kind of have a thing that they could put back in place after they've gone through it. Now it wasn't going to hold water, but when water was high and the Union fleet was really angry, or the commander of a boat was really angry at a particular civilian, they would cut through the levee and then flood the civilian out. So they did that on a few occasions. So they're using these natural conditions. Both sides are trying to bend these natural conditions in their favor.
That is fascinating and also sort of adds to this kind of dismal picture that we've created here.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask you two more questions. I want to let everyone in the chat know that this is the time. If you have anything else to ask Robert, ask now and I'll make sure to include it. But I did want to signal that this book, The Devil's Own Purgatory, has become a finalist for a really prestigious prize. This is the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, which is awarded annually for the finest scholarly work in English on Abraham Lincoln, the American Civil War soldier, or the American Civil War era. So I wanted to congratulate you for
thank
that
you.
prestigious honor and ask you how does it feel to be a finalist for the prize?
uh, well, it feels shocking in some ways. I mean, I'd known that the press was going to put the book to the prize committee, but there were over 90 books that were considered, and so to be one of the finalists, I was explaining it to my wife, and for me, this feels like being nominated for an Oscar for Best Picture
Yeah.
because it's your peers in a lot of ways who are saying this is you've done something really good here, and we think this is the best of the best.
That's wonderful, and that I feel like that's how it should feel. And I wish you the best of luck on that process as it goes forward. I think it's going to be in March or April that we'll know.
Yeah, the winner will be announced in March, and then there's a celebration in April where all the finalists and the winner will be there. And I'll just add one thing that makes this, I think, especially poignant for me. I went to school at LSU for my PhD. That's not the only reason I published at LSU Press, but it's one of the reasons. And my dissertation advisor was Charlie Royster. He won the Lincoln Prize in 1992. And the winner of the Lincoln Prize, you get cash, but you also get a bust of Lincoln that's about a foot and a half, 2 feet high. He donated his bust, and it's on display at the Hill Memorial Library on LSU's campus. And so I went when I was doing research for my dissertation. I would walk past that bust pretty much every day going into the archive. So it's pretty cool to have that personal connection, with my advisor being and a winner, and with me being a nominee or a finalist.
That is really cool, and obviously our offices are on LSU's campus, and so now I know to look at that at the Hill Memorial Library. I never
Yeah,
knew it was
yeah,
there.
it's the archive. So it's not it's not the Middleton, not the regular one. It's the archival library.
I want to ask you a final question, and this is our standard final questions for our authors. But beforehand, I wanted to mention a comment from Bill. This is a great program. Thanks, he says. Thanks, Bill, for tuning in. And thank you, everyone else, for spending your afternoon with us. We really appreciate it. Um, the last question we ask authors is you have this book that's come out. What's next?
Nothing.
Nothing.
No, I'm actually working on about 3 or 4 things at the same time. I'm working with one of my grad students who I briefly referenced, Sean, and we're working with a small team of researchers at CSU, and we're going through every muster roll from the Mississippi Squadron. So not sampling them like I did for the book, but every single one. And we're collecting information on the Black sailors. And we're going to make a database or assemble a database and then make it publicly available because especially for African Americans in the United States, if they're doing genealogical research, they often hit a wall around 1860 if they had an enslaved ancestor. But there's a lot of information on these Black men who served in the squadron. And also, it can be used for other purposes as well by researchers. So that's one thing. And there are a couple others, but the main one that I'm doing is I've begun research to write a comparative history of 2 Civil War regiments. So I'm born and raised in Minnesota, and I'm going to do a comparative history of the first Minnesota, which was in the Army of the Potomac in the Eastern Theater, fought in Virginia and fought the major battles there, and the second Minnesota, which was in the Western Theater and was at Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge and Sherman's March, and they began their Civil War journeys at about the same time, but they're in very different places. And so I see it as kind of a science experiment. It's how did the being in the different theaters affect these men? Did it have any effect, or was the war basically the same for them, east and west?
Um, that all sounds like really important work, and we appreciate you doing it. I want to end with this comment from Jim Jones in the chat. Jim says, "Love the book. I would encourage everyone to read it." I agree wholeheartedly. And a reminder that you can get this book at a discount. There's a 40% off discount code in the chat, so make sure to look for that. Once more, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and our next book launch will be on Wednesday. It's going to be a poetry collection called Driving the Beast. And so if you are free, tune in. And otherwise, thanks again, Robert, and everyone have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.